Okay, welcome to Chapter 10. There's going to be a few changes with Chapter 10. One of the things I'd like you to do is when you're looking on Blackboard, if you'll go down to the supplemental material, that would be the Course Resources tab there, you'll notice that there is a substitute, a revised Chapter 10. What I'm doing here is I'm going to be including material that is specific to North Carolina. Now, this is not going to show up on tests necessarily. This is for your edification and so that we can explain how this all works a little bit better in North Carolina. So again, if you're trying to follow along with these slides and you use your regular slides, you're going to see some absences, the slides I put in from North Carolina, and I'll highlight those when I get to them in this presentation. But be aware that there's some additional slides that I put in that are going to be under the revised Chapter 10. Having said that, I think this is a good chapter to start off with because many of my students have lots of questions about homicide, and many of you have seen way too many Law and Orders or different dramas on TV, and I think this is going to be a helpful one to kind of get over some of those issues. Again, like all chapters, there is some learning objectives. These are helpful to know going in. I recommend you read them over, but again, not critical enough for me to go ahead and cover them. Okay, so let's talk about homicide in general. So the death of any person caused by another person is called a homicide. Now, obviously, there are cases where no criminal charge will be brought, or a charge will be brought and then there is an adequate defense. So we're talking about, is it justifiable or is it an excusable homicide? And of course, some things we simply don't prosecute, although arguably they are homicides in some way because they're intentionally killing another human being, but society has carved out exceptions for that. One example would be killing in war. Homicides that are not either justifiable or where there are legal excuses for the crime, for the acts, are crimes. And what we do is we classify all the homicides. And in most jurisdictions, including North Carolina, we break it down. So North Carolina, and again, you'll see a slide on this in a minute, has murder statutes, has manslaughter statutes, has death by motor vehicle statutes. We have certain statutes regarding negligence. So most jurisdiction criminal homicides are classified as murders, manslaughters, or something else. And that's pretty much how North Carolina does it. Okay, so what does North Carolina do? And this is the first one of those slides that is not in your regular slide packet, but again is down in the course resources. So the big four in North Carolina are first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and involuntary manslaughter. Now I say those are the big four. There are other homicide statutes in North Carolina. And you know, they've in the 2000s, once I started practicing law, they actually added some. So it's not necessarily a closed area. So when we're talking North Carolina, for example, we have first-degree murder, we have second-degree murder. Then North Carolina recently, I say recently, within the last 10 years or so, has added murder of an unborn child. We have added voluntary manslaughter of an unborn child. We also have statutes that I'm not going to go over directly, such as felony death by vehicle, sometimes called felony death by motor vehicle, aggravated felony death by vehicle, repeated felony death by motor vehicle, and misdemeanor death by motor vehicle, believe it or not. All those are crimes in North Carolina. But I'm just going to focus on the ones that most students, when they look at it, are really focused on, and that's going to be the first-degree murder charges, second-degree murder, voluntary and involuntary. Now, interestingly enough, in North Carolina, you're going to find your first and second-degree murders in North Carolina General Statutes. That's what that abbreviation means, NCGS. That's going to be in Chapter 14, So the North Carolina General Statutes are divided into chapters. The 14th one has most of the criminal law in it. There's some criminal law up in the there's some regulatory, but there's some up in motor vehicles in a few places. But most of it's going to be found in Chapter 14, and you're going to find it in Section 17. Now, Section 17 is going to define both first-degree murder and second-degree murder. Now, interestingly, in North Carolina, involuntary manslaughter and voluntary manslaughter are common law crimes, which means these are crimes that the general legislature has, although it's defined some parts of them, there's no separate specific law. And so these are kind of better defined by court cases and the common law than they are by statute. All right, moving on. Your book talks about the Corpus Delicti. This means the body or the substance of the crime. Now, generally in North Carolina, and there can be some confusion here, when you're going to talk elements of the crime. Now, people tend to think, well, Corpus Delicti, that means body. You must be talking about the body of the person. And no, we're not. But the body of the person can be very important, because in all homicide cases, you have to prove that a person has died. And that person is going to have to be a human being. You're also going to have to prove that another person caused that death. That's going to be the defendant. And that this was either done knowingly, intentionally, purposely, or recklessly or negligently. And those are all going to help define what you're going to charge that defendant with. Now, getting back to the kind of exception to this Corpus Delicti, and I wish your book hadn't associated these, but it's together in your text, so. It's very hard to get a conviction in a case if you cannot produce a body, because it's not that you're violating Corpus Delicti in that it says literally produce the body, but it's you have to prove that another living human being is dead. And without a body, that's quite difficult. So how can it be done? Well, one of the big ways is confessions. And certainly circumstantial evidence. Now, there are some unique rules that saying a confession by itself generally is not enough unless there's some corroborative evidence. And an example here would be if someone that had a mental condition came in and confessed to a crazy crime. You know, he says, I killed Fred Jones. And the police go and they can't find anybody. They can't find any evidence that a Fred Jones existed. This would really lack the ability to prove that a homicide was committed. Okay, you have to be alive, and we're going to get into a little bit of a contentious issue here. Homicide requires that a person be alive. Now, the prosecution has to show that the individual was alive at the time of the act. You cannot kill someone who is already dead. Now, different states will call that a different crime. If I take a gun and I walk up to a casket where a person is already dead, laid out, and I shoot the body, it's not a homicide. Now, it may be, as I said, it's got tons of different names in different states, but it can be called doing violence to a corpse. But that's not going to be a homicide. It also, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about, it also is a fact that just because a victim is about to die from something else doesn't mean that we don't have a homicide. So the famous case in law school is an individual jumps off of a roof. And as he's falling, and let's suppose it's 100 stories. So he's clearly going to die when he hits the ground. I shoot a gun, the bullet goes out the window and hits the person and kills him instantly before he can hit the ground. Well, you could say, well, he's going to die. He was committing suicide. Are you going to charge a homicide? The answer there is you can. Because it doesn't matter if he's about to die. I hate to break it to you all, but we're all going to die at some point. Now, In some states, we focus on brain death. In other states, we look at heartbeats and respiration, believe it or not. Now, traditionally, under North Carolina law, you were not a human being until you took your first breath. At the other end, the law is a lot murkier. So most of the time, you know, if you're not breathing, your heart's also not beating and your brain's also dead. So it's not a huge issue. Now, in most cases, we do have to determine cause of death. Now, cause of death is not necessarily going to be a sole factor issue. So you might have a death certificate or a cause of death. They might come back and they say, this individual died of a gunshot wound, but he also bled to death because he was a hemophiliac. And that would be a contributing factor. And we're seeing this in the news right now. I'm recording this lecture during the COVID outbreak, and you're hearing people say, well, how many people are dying of COVID and how many people are dying of respiratory issues? And the answer is they're dying of both. It's just when you catch a disease that kills you, it usually kills you in conjunction with something else. There are pre-existing conditions. All right. North Carolina human beings and elements. Now, to charge a homicide in North Carolina, you have to prove the victim was alive at the time of the crime. If not, it's not a homicide. And generally, we use the term elements of a crime or parts of a crime. And when I get to the first slide coming up after this discussion question about some of the homicides, I'll use the term element, and I'll be a little bit clearer. We have this common law requirement, excuse me. We have this common law requirement. Each state makes certain decisions regarding abortion, assisted suicide, and termination of life support. All of these, of course, are really subject to constitutional protections. So, some states have elected to legalize assisted suicide, and the technical name of assisted suicide is euthanasia. All states, under the doctrine that was created in Roe versus Wade, must allow for lawful abortions. Now, this really gets to the issue of when is a fetus a human being and alive and you can charge. So traditionally in North Carolina, the rule was if the baby took a breath, it's alive. And if it didn't, it's a fetus. Now, there were still very severe penalties in North Carolina for killing a fetus, either in the womb or not. But it was not a homicide. Now, there is this contentious issue in America today about what is or is not a homicide and does a fetus qualify. I can only state that the Supreme Court has pretty much struck down attempts to make the termination of a pregnancy a homicide. It has recognized a constitutional right for a woman to terminate her pregnancy outside of the fear of being charged with a criminal act. At the other end of the spectrum, the end-of-life decisions. These are all often very murky as well. Many general legislatures, and North Carolina is guilty of this, have really not well codified what you can do at end of life, what decisions you can make. So, for example, in North Carolina, we have a living will provision in our statutes where you can say, I don't want extraordinary means to keep me alive. But we have no exception per se built into our first and second degree murder cases. It is theoretically possible for someone that was to turn off a life support machine or to end assistance to be charged with first-degree murder in North Carolina, because it clearly would be a premeditated act. The law is just very messy there. And I'd like to say, here's a clear line, and we've addressed this, and we're good, but we haven't. Okay. This is one of those statutes that's relatively recent, in the last 10 or 15 years in North Carolina. We created the crime murder of an unborn child. And what we said was, first of all, we defined unborn child in North Carolina, and that's a member of the species Homo sapien at any stage of development who's being carried in the womb. Now, this is being used and can be used, I think, where if, let's suppose you have a pregnant woman who has a fetus which is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months in development, gestation, up to, now obviously pregnancies run beyond 9 months. But let's just say 8 months, 29 days. If someone was to take a gun and shoot that woman in the womb, and the bullet was to destroy the fetus, you in North Carolina would charge murder of an unborn child. This law is designed to deal with, in part, the issue of abortion without violating Roe versus Wade. So if you were to, in theory under this statute, I would say, get an abortion past the point of viability or past different points, it's conceivable you could be charged under this. However, this is generally not available to charge people who get abortions during the first trimester or certain other circumstances. Okay, causation. What the state has to show is that what happened was a result, a direct result, and the proximate cause of the harm that occurred. So what do we mean by that? We mean, for a homicide, that sometimes it's very easy to establish that A killed B. So A takes a gun, puts it at his head, pulls the trigger. B, the bullet goes into B's brain, kills him. What you can show is that A killed B. But sometimes there is additional things that result in it, or there are subsequent actions. So what we're going to look for is, are these things causation, not sole causation? And there's two examples there in your book, but let's look at the first one. A shoots B, wounding him. Okay, so remember, A takes the gun, shoots B. Now B is afraid, jumps in the river to try to get away, and drowns. You would say that A still killed B. Now he might have drowned, and he voluntarily jumped in the river, but he only jumped in the river because A shot him. There used to be, and I hesitate to introduce this, but I'll mention this, something called the year and a day rule. If whatever act A didn't result in B's death within a year and a day, then it wasn't going to be a homicide. That's been abolished in North Carolina in almost all jurisdictions. What we're really looking for is, did you proximately cause? And I always want to say the term substantially assist in the commission of the murder. So, what would have to show in North Carolina? The state does not have to prove that it was the sole or even the immediate cause of death, only that the act was a natural result of some criminal act. It is not a defense in North Carolina to say, oh, okay, I shot him, but he had a heart condition that as soon as the shock of the bullet hit him in the hand, which normally would not be a fatal wound, it caused him to die. So what he died of was the heart disease. No, what he died of is you shooting him. Even in cases of medical malpractice, you can still be charged with a homicide because you're the one who put the individual in the position where they got poor medical care. Intervening causes. Now, sometimes there is some break in between, which is so great that we say, okay, this intervening cause has broken the chain between the two. So, one second. Just a pause, but. Okay, sorry I had to delay this. You might notice a little gap here, but we're talking now about intervening causes. So what happens when there is some contributing event or some event is between what the defendant did and the victim's death? So what we look at is we look at a chain of causation. And your book gives two, I think, pretty good examples, and I think they help us understand this pretty well. In example A, okay, the first example, A stabs B. So I take a knife and I stab Fred in the chest. And it's an injury where he's going to die. But in between that fatal injury and B actually dying, C comes around, sees him dying, takes his wallet, decides he doesn't want to leave a witness, takes a gun, shoots him in the head, and instantly causes him. And when we do the autopsy, sure, C's bullet is the thing that caused him. Can you charge A or me here with the homicide? And the answer there is going to be no, because there is an intervening event which has broken the chain of causation. Now, if, however, whatever is going on is foreseeable, then it may not do that. It may not break it. So here's another example. Again, A stabs B, serious wound. They put B on a stretcher, they put him in an ambulance, drive him to the hospital. A doctor shows up, doctor's called C in this example, and he makes a mistake. He commits medical malpractice, and B dies. And the cause of his death is an overdose of anesthetic. It's a negligent act, but it's foreseeable. Therefore, it is not an intervening cause, and you can still convict A of the crime. Okay, so under the common law and statutory law, and remember, North Carolina is both a common law for the purposes of voluntary and involuntary manslaughter and a statutory state. And it talks about intent and premeditation here. And it's a little bit, I think, confusing reading your text and in this slide. First-degree murder typically requires premeditation. And premeditation is sometimes called malice aforethought. I think that muddies the water because it brings malice into the picture. But really, premeditation is a brief time to reflect that you want to commit the act. Now, sometimes you can show that someone is so careless, so reckless, that even though they didn't intend to kill, they intended to commit an act that is so reckless and dangerous that you can charge a homicide, potentially a premeditated homicide. And in most states, though, okay, we also have, well, if the crime occurred during the commission of certain felonies, even though you didn't have the intent to kill in that felony, it triggers what we call the murder felony rule, and the result of which is you can be charged with first-degree murder. So this is North Carolina's first-degree murder statute. you kill another living human being, and you do it one of the four ways here. First, with malice and specific intent and or premeditation. Two, you kill them using poison, lying in wait, imprisonment, starvation, or torture. We're talking intentional poisoning here. The rest are obviously intentional. It's hard to not intentionally ambush someone, or not intentionally imprison them, or not intentionally starve them. And how do you torture people unintentionally? And here's the murder felony rule in North Carolina. Well, you are committing an arson, a rape, a sex offense, a robbery, a burglary, a kidnapping, or any felony with a deadly weapon, that's going to trigger murder felony. So if I went into a store and I kidnapped a woman, and as I was going out, the gun went off, so I was committing a kidnapping and she died, and the gun went off by accident, still chargeable. And also, believe it or not, North Carolina makes it first-degree murder if you use a weapon of mass destruction, which is included in biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons. Okay, so we do have malice as a part of our murders. And malice really means an ill will or hatred, or what we call, or an extremely reckless act. We also talk about premeditation along with malice. And you shouldn't confuse the two, and that's why I wish your book hadn't used malice aforethought. But premeditation is not the sort of mystery movie or crime drama where, you know, they want to kill Lord Fauntleroy and they wait for him to walk across the drawbridge into his castle and push the gargoyle onto him because they've been waiting up there. Those types of murders never happen. Premeditation can be a brief moment of cool reflection, which can be just a couple seconds long. And it does not require that you intended that to be the only act, okay? But it was deliberate and planned. So, again, malice in North Carolina, ill will, hatred, or spite. Or malice can be inferred from the commission of an inherently dangerous act in a reckless disregard for human life, or, and I love this language, deliberately bent on mischief. Also an act without justification, cause, or excuse. Premeditation is thinking about an act for however brief a time. And we do not require this to be a long period of time. It can be a couple seconds. Now, how's that proved? Well, you're not going to prove it very often by asking the defendant, because two reasons. One, he's got the Fifth Amendment. He may not have to answer. And two, he may lie. So you're going to prove premeditation circumstantially. Quick example. If I come home and catch my wife in bed with another man, and I have a gun on me, and I pull it out and shoot them, that lacks circumstantial evidence of premeditation. But if I come home, I catch my wife in bed with another man, I go downstairs, I load a gun, I come back up, and I shoot them, that means that there was a space between the two, and that's really going to show that there was premeditation, circumstantially. Okay, the murder felony rule, which I referred to a little bit before. Most states and the federal government, and North Carolina includes this, have a murder felony rule or statute. And what this says is if you kill someone during the commission of those crimes that I showed you for first-degree murder, it is a murder felony, and it's a first-degree murder charge. There has to be a relationship between the two, but if it's there, that's enough. You can say, okay, you killed someone while you were robbing them. You killed someone while you were kidnapping them. You maybe didn't intend to kill them while you kidnapped them. You were going to release them unharmed, but they died. Too bad, so sad. That's going to be a first-degree murder charge in North Carolina. All right, so under North Carolina's murder felony, it can be a completed felony or an attempted felony. You can try to rape someone, try to kidnap someone, try to rob someone, and that's enough. If the act was accidental, during the commission of a felony is not a defense. Hey, the gun went off while I was kidnapping him. Not a defense. And here's something that most people don't think of under what's basically called the circumstantial application, is the murder felony rule can be triggered before a crime, during a crime, or after the murder. So if I killed someone, and let's suppose it was a second-degree murder, but I decided, well, I'm going to set fire to the house to hide it, I committed an act of arson that was part of the transaction of the homicide. It's chargeable as a first-degree murder. All right, so deadly weapon. This is where some things are what we say under the law, per se deadly weapons. Per se deadly weapons are firearms. In every case, if you have a gun, it is a per se deadly weapon. Other things can be circumstantial. 2x4s, knives, clubs. They may be deadly weapons, they may not be deadly weapons. We look at the circumstances. If you use a deadly weapon, it creates an inference, okay, that can be rebutted that you intended to kill when you use them. Okay, transferred intent. So here's the example. I take out a gun. I point it at Fred. Fred moves to the side as I shoot the bullet. The bullet misses Fred and hits John. I was trying to kill Fred. I accidentally killed John. Is that an intentional first-degree murder? And the answer is yes, because it doesn't matter whether the intended victim dies or the unintended victim dies, it's still first-degree murder. Let's suppose I go to burn down Fred's house. And I don't know it, but Fred's not home, but his wife is home. The house burns down, Fred's wife dies. Again, transferred intent is going to say it's a first-degree murder charge. Okay, second-degree murder. And we're going to look at North Carolina second-degree murder statute in just a second. It's usually briefer. Maybe you were trying to cause serious bodily harm. Maybe you didn't intend to cause death, but you were reckless. Maybe it was an extreme indifference. Typically, though, for second-degree murder, there is no premeditation. If there's premeditation, it's going to kick it up to first-degree murder. So this is North Carolina's. 1, you kill another human being with malice. Remember, malice can be, if we go back, that ill will, that hatred. But you'll notice that absent here is the premeditation or those specific crimes you could commit in North Carolina or the murder felony rule. Now, 2 things I think are important. 1, and this is true of almost all second-degree murder charges, there's no specific intent to kill, so you cannot charge attempted second-degree murder. It's either going to be a manslaughter or a first degree. There's no attempted second degree. Also, and this is something that can be easily charged in North Carolina, if you distribute a controlled substance and that controlled substance leads to a death, that will create the presumption of a second-degree murder in North Carolina, because you're engaging in an act that's reckless. Okay, let's talk about manslaughter. Now, your book says historically it's divided into 2 states. We do that. Some states only have 1 charge of manslaughter. We have 2. Some states have added vehicular manslaughter. We've created a separate crime called felony death by motor vehicle and misdemeanor death by motor vehicle. Now, voluntary manslaughter is usually worse. Involuntary manslaughter is usually a little bit better, lower charge. So voluntary, you're not going to have the malice, the premeditation. And you sometimes will have either an imperfect defense, imperfect self-defense, or imperfect necessity, or you can show that you didn't have time for reflection. Heat of the moment is usually voluntary manslaughter. Involuntary is even more minor, and we'll look at those in North Carolina in just a second. So, voluntary manslaughter in North Carolina, you kill another human being without malice. That's voluntary manslaughter. Involuntary, you kill another human being by an unlawful act that's not a felony, and or you were culpably a negligent act or omission. That's going to be involuntary manslaughter. All right, let's talk a little bit about heat of passion here. Again, this is something I think that suffered from way too many Hollywood movies or TV programs. Basically, all states let you go to a voluntary manslaughter if you can show that you were in an extreme emotional state. You have to have some act that would force a reasonable person to act in the extreme. And the classic example here is the immediate discovery of infidelity. And this goes back to the patriarchy and a ton of things like that. But basically, you come home, you catch your husband, wife, significant other in bed with another person, in flagrant delicto, I think it's called. If you immediately act, you are killing in the heat of passion. And that's going to be a manslaughter charge, a voluntary manslaughter charge. If you wait, like I said, if you go down and load the gun and you come back up, it's going to be a first-degree murder charge. It also has to be related to the person you're killing, the act itself. You know, if your friend introduced your wife to somebody else and they ran off together and you said, well, that makes me so mad, I'm going to kill my friend, well, that's not the provocation. So that would be a failure of the defense. Self-defense. Now remember, if you can prove self-defense, and we talked about this before, if you are perfect in proving it, okay, then you walk away from the crime. There's no criminal liability, but the burden's on you to prove it. But let's suppose you can't prove it completely. It's imperfect self-defense. It doesn't meet the requirements of self-defense, but it still was an action taken because you believed reasonably that it would be self-defense. In that case, usually imperfect self-defense will result in a manslaughter charge. Involuntary manslaughter is the least serious of the four major homicide charges in North Carolina. You don't have to prove intent. You have to show an unlawful act. Sometimes we call this unintentional or unlawful act manslaughter. But we're looking for negligence. Now, not the negligence that goes all the way up to the first degree. But, for example, you're hunting in the woods and you see a deer on the top of a hill, silhouetted perfectly against it. Now, a good hunter knows that you don't fire at the top of the hill because if you miss, that bullet's going to go over the hill and come down, and it might hit somebody. Let's suppose that happens. You shoot a buck at the top of a hill. The bullet misses the buck, passes over the hill, comes down, and hits Johnny, who's on the other side. That was negligent. It's not a fatally bent, extreme, crazy negligence. It's still extreme and it's unlawful, so we're going to charge you with an involuntary manslaughter. We also have in North Carolina two different homicide statutes for cars. Felony death by motor vehicle, which is typically used when you kill someone drunk driving, and misdemeanor death by motor vehicle, which is when you kill someone and you're violating, like speeding, or you run through a stop sign. Suicide. Suicide is not a crime. Persons who participate or assist another, it can be a crime. Now, many states make the crime of assisted suicide homicide. Technically, in North Carolina, assisting a suicide would be a first-degree murder case. The U.S. Supreme Court has left it up to the states. And what they have said is that if the states want to specifically enact a law that allows you to assist someone, to give them a drug, to provide the prescription for the drug, whatever, so that they may act to take their own life, or to withhold medication, that's okay, death with dignity. Doesn't violate the Constitution. North Carolina hasn't gone there. We have no death with dignity law. We do have Declaration for Desire for Natural Death, which says you can withhold certain treatment, and that's a pretty fine line if you think about it. What's the difference between me intentionally withholding something that will save you and actually giving you something that will kill you? It's a very fine line, but North Carolina's there. Okay, on that, that's Chapter 10. It's really the first one that we're going to look at that's going to have more of the homicides and crime-specific North Carolina. All right, other than that, have a good night.